with us as a keynote speaker this morning, Antar Jutla. He's an environmental engineering sciences associate professor at the University of Florida in Gainesville. He's received bachelor's, master's, and PhDs from Punjab Agricultural University, University of Saskatchewan, and Tufts. The central theme of his research is to understand the role of humans in the hydrological cycle, or in other words, the coupling between human and natural systems. Within this context, the bulk of his research is focused on quantifying the influence of weather, climatic, and environmental processes on the abundance and presence of infectious pathogens. And after that, predicting the risk of the outbreak of infectious diseases in the human population. Dr. Jutla has developed a highly interdisciplinary platform called GeoHealth and Hydrology Laboratory, which I assume he'll be telling us more about today, that specializes in the use of satellite remote sensing data to develop algorithms to identify complex spatiotemporal patterns to address issues of changing variability in climatic processes on the emergence of pathogenic niches. His research has been funded through NASA, NIH, NSF, USDA, USGS, EPA, the United Kingdom Department for International Development, I hadn't heard of that one, and the Department of Transportation. So without further ado, Antar, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, guys, for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be meeting with you all virtually. And I'm going to be talking about some of my work that we have been doing over the last several years. And then basically we'll have some interactions on what we are missing versus where we got it right versus wrong. We're going to be talking about a concept that we are building for our last 4 or 5 years, just after COVID started. It's called the predictive intelligence for infectious diseases. And I'm going to go in a little bit details on what does that mean and why we are not calling it a prediction and why we are calling it a predictive intelligence. And we're going to be looking at 2 current ongoing pandemics, the cholera and the COVID-19. And then we will see how we have developed techniques, models, modeling architecture to understand when and where these 2 diseases are going to put humans at risk of interaction with pathogens. So I would like to start with this image. This is a summary of all the major pandemics that have impacted humans since 1347. Now, we made the figure, but it's a compilation from various data sources. We were interested to look here was that, okay, is there a change in the origin of these pandemics? Is there a mortality changes? Are there changes in the years that a particular pandemic has lasted? And then where it originated and how it basically spread in the entire world. So if you look at the medieval history, what we will see is that the bacteria basically dominated the global pandemics. It was particularly the cholera or cholera-related pandemics that basically started somewhere in the Asian regions. And then as global traffic increased with travel and all those things, it basically spread to the other locations of the world. But something happened in middle of 20th century, somewhere in 1950s, where we started to see more viral infections or the interactions of a population with viruses. And then the virus basically started dominating the pandemics. As of today, we have the 7th pandemic of cholera and the COVID-19 as the 2 pandemics that are ongoing, and it is putting a considerable population at constant risk of infection. One of the things to note here is that the bacteria-based pandemics lasted for over several years, and the duration was way higher than the viral outbreaks, which is a little bit interesting, but I think we also have to think about the mortality that comes with the virus and bacterial pandemics. The viral pandemics tend to have a significant, quick impact on human population than the bacterial pandemics. But we are still trying to understand the intricacies of these bacteria versus viral pandemics. So in order to understand what I'm going to talk today for like next 40 minutes, we must understand some of the assumptions, conditions, and some of the basic ideas on which we have developed our research. So the program that we have built is highly interdisciplinary. It is in collaboration with University of Maryland, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, University of Alabama, Florida, and so on. We are only focusing on environmentally sensitive pathogens, meaning that we are looking for those pathogens, those clinically relevant pathogens, where the life cycle of that pathogen is somehow related to the environment and that is further modulated with the climate and then weather processes. We make a categorical difference between a simulation and a prediction. For us, the simulation is a generation of what if scenarios type of activities. A common example is the SIR type of architecture for epidemiological models. SIR stands for the susceptible, infected, and recovered type of models. Prediction is something where we are trying to understand the true unknown, meaning that we have no idea what is going to happen for a pathogen, and then basically we are trying to see under what conditions a pathogen will emerge. We can use the SIR architectures for prediction, but we argue that that won't be a true prediction. So think of prediction as hurricanes, as a prediction of snowstorms. And then predictions are generally driven in our lab through a hypothesis. If there is no hypothesis, then we don't really think that a prediction is possible for a particular pathogen. And with that, we have some assumptions and we have some conditions which we have developed over 2 decades. And it is important to understand that because that will help us to basically see how we have developed our models. And as Madhav said, like it will help us to basically understand how climate change, climate variability is going to impact when, where, and how a particular pathogen is going to impact human population. So our first assumption is that we cannot separate the environment in which humans live and interact with pathogens. That basically means that if a pathogen is environmentally sensitive, it will have some interaction, and that interaction needs to be quantified in order to basically scale it up for prediction. A physical hypothesis must be developed and should dictate the modeling architecture. If our lab is not able to develop a hypothesis, whether it is testable or not testable, that's a different story, then we would not develop a prediction model. We don't really go after the curve fitting type of exercises. Unless there is a physical hypothesis, we will not basically develop a model. We also understand that prevalence and incidence of epidemiological data will not be available. And that's true. We have seen it during COVID. We have seen it during SARS-CoV-1. We have seen in regions where cholera is prevalent. We have seen this thing during Ebola outbreaks and so on. And we also argue that the accurate prediction, accurate true unknown will not be possible. But predictive intelligence may be achievable in future. And what this predictive intelligence is within the context of infectious diseases is a collective set of actions that must be taken to reduce the burden of disease in human population. We argue that a single set of prediction will not be sufficient for achieving desired goals of reducing disease burden, and that the local knowledge must be utilized to design appropriate intervention and mitigation strategies. So predictive intelligence is a collective set of actions that starts with the modeling architecture, but it ends up in the users and stakeholders' hands so that they can make decisions, either that is reactionary or anticipatory decisions, that's their prerogative, but that ends up with the end users. So basically, what are we trying to achieve here now? This figure here shows a known book by Hippocrates, who back in like 4th century suggested that whosoever wants to pursue the science of medicine must first investigate the seasons of the year and what occurs in them. This is a famous saying, and epidemiologists, biostatisticians are very familiar with this one. But despite significant advances in the etiology of pathogenesis, we are still not able to predict when and where an outbreak of disease will occur. is a prediction system for diseases feasible? We argue that, again, like the intelligence can be developed, but a hardcore prediction system may not be really possible. And we also ask a question in our lab that can we do better for the next pandemics? Like we ask the question, what would the next pandemic be like with the availability of data sets that we have, with the computation power that we have? Can we identify patterns? Can we identify like the system memory from which we can basically devise strategies as to how we argue that we won't be able to prevent the next pandemics, but we can reduce the public health burden for this one. And we're going to see how we have developed these things for cholera and COVID-19. But why we are after prediction? So all we want to do is to identify the intervention point. So if we assume that this black line is the epidemiological incidence or prevalence time series, so if we are at a very beginning of an outbreak, meaning there are few cases, including the index case, then can we basically identify a particular point at which we can reduce the public health burden such that it will limit the spread of the disease in human population? The identification of intervention point is quite critical because it depends on how the resources can be allocated to different programs. The intervention during the beginning of an outbreak versus when the outbreak is full-blown is going to have a significant implications on public health. So all we are trying to do is to determine where is this intervention point. Are we willing to have intervention point prior to even the index cases, or we can afford some cases and then basically limit the outbreak of a full-blown disease? For doing this thing, we focus on water-related diseases. Our lab is a hydrology lab. We specialize in environmental engineering. So water is obviously a choice for us because we understand how water moves in and around and how climate and weather system impacts these water processes. The statistics suggest that the 50% of global population lives within 50 miles of the coast. And the water-related diarrheal diseases remains the leading cause of death in the world. And these pathogens cannot be eradicated, meaning that they will adapt, they will survive, they will find a new ecological niche. And upon a favorable interaction with humans, they will cause a disease outbreak. The figure here shows the major population centers. These population centers are the ones where we have 1 million and higher populations. The black rectangles show the regions where one or more of diarrheal diseases have been reported. And it's not a pandemic, it's the massive outbreak. A massive outbreak means that we have seen a systematic failure of intervention and mitigation strategies that have resulted in more than 100,000 cases of diarrheal diseases. So this was a global context, but within the context of the US, so this figure shows the major city or major hubs in the US where we have seen massive increases in population since 2000, which might be changing. This figure was drawn pre-COVID, so there might be some changes in populations. But the extreme events, which includes the temperature events or the natural disasters in all these regions, which closely lie in vicinity of large water bodies, coasts, is basically increasing over the last several years. So we need to understand how population is going to be interacting with the water and water systems in future in order to understand how water-related diseases are going to be an issue for future timescale. And for that one, we went to the first pandemics, the cholera pandemics in the world. So cholera pandemics is not a new disease. It has been with us for over centuries. Cholera is completely curable. We have antibiotics with us that can cure cholera. A simple oral rehydration solution can cure cholera within 48 hours, but still a considerable chunk of population is at a constant risk of cholera. We have seen a recent massive outbreaks in Malawi. We are seeing increases in cases in Mozambique and the Western Africa. And it's not that we don't know how to treat it. The question is, when do we have to relay that information to stakeholders, end users, field guys, NGOs, to basically start making those plans? And why did we focus on cholera was because we have about 200 years of data sets with us, both in terms of cases, surveillance, and more than like 50 years of microbiological data set. So we were able to develop the hypotheses, which can then be related to the intelligence systems. So the work that we have done, it has the roots that started in 1960s. So the microbiological theories always dictate our hypotheses. So this work is in collaboration with Dr. Rita Colwell's lab in University of Maryland. Back in 60s and 70s, despite criticism and all those things, there were field experiments that showed that climate and weather parameters impact the growth of the vibrios. Vibrios are the pathogens that cause cholera. And those responses were established back in like 60s and 70s. It was followed with the field campaigns to understand the very fine scale role of temperature, precipitation, salinity, all kinds of like ecological, chemical, and physical water quality parameters. And then came the satellites. So once the field campaigns were verified and the microbiological theories were developed, we started to basically look for the tools, sensors that can provide us the measures of those parameters that impact the growth of the Vibrio cholera, the bacteria for cholera. We heavily relied on use of Earth observations. Earth observations means these are the satellite sensors. And back in 2000s was one of the first papers which has suggested that a coastal ecological process can be proxied using satellite-derived chlorophyll and sea surface temperatures that can then be developed into a forecasting system for cholera. Based on that, we developed a highly sophisticated cholera model. And in 2020, 2021, we were able to provide a real-time cholera predictive intelligence system, which is now operational in various countries in Africa and in Asia. And then we're going to basically go into the details on what these models are. But remember, we have to start with the hypothesis. If there is no hypothesis, our lab will not develop the model. So based on 150 years of precisely collected diarrheal disease data sets from libraries in England to the data sets from India and Bangladesh, we were able to identify 3 different modes of cholera. These modes were named as endemic cholera mode, mixed mode cholera, and the epidemic modes of cholera. The endemic modes of cholera are the ones where this disease persisted in a region throughout the year. Most of the time, it was observed in the coastal regions. We hypothesized that the seawater intrusion and the relationship between how the rivers and the coastal water systems behave over different time periods in a year basically promote the movement of bacteria from coasts to inland water bodies. In the epidemic modes of cholera, the human population is generally very prepared for dealing with this disease. Why? Because they know that if they are going to boil the water, they're going to basically kill this bacteria, and then there won't be a massive outbreak of this disease in human populations. So endemic cholera is most prevalent in coastal towns of Bangladesh, India, and in parts of Africa. The next mode is the epidemic mode. The epidemic mode is a more serious one, and it is a sporadic but deadly cholera outbreak where we see a massive number of cases of cholera over a very short period of time. When you're thinking of short period of time, we're thinking about 2 to 3 months. And it often occurs following a disturbance in a way humans interact with the water systems. And we hypothesize that it is a combination of temperatures, precipitation, and a water insecurity that basically leads to this epidemic modes of cholera. Epidemic cholera can convert itself into endemic cholera given certain conditions. The last mode is a mixed mode of cholera. This is a highly specialized mode where we see two peaks of cholera in a year. This type of cholera is basically an integration of an epidemic and an endemic cholera. And mixed mode cholera is generally observed in Dhaka region in Bangladesh and in some regions in Mozambique. We don't see a lot of mixed modes of cholera in the world. We're going to focus on the epidemic modes of cholera today. And our working hypothesis is that if we have warm temperatures, which is followed by very heavy precipitation, and there are issues of water insecurity, meaning that there is a behavior change in how humans are basically interacting or using the water for their daily activities. If that happens, then the risk of cholera is quite high. And there is a time lag involved in this one. So if we have warm temperatures 2 months in advance, followed by 4 weeks in advance of heavy precipitation, and then we have a water insecurity conditions, then the risk is quite high. If any of these conditions is not met, if temperatures are not warm, if there are no water insecurity conditions, or if there is no anomalous precipitation, then the risk of cholera in a particular region remains quite low. This is our working hypothesis for the epidemic cholera, and we have tested it in over 56 locations in the world. And then we have an accuracy of about 95% in validating this hypothesis. Our model is a complex weighted regression type of model where we have used different modules to construct an interactive terms. We call it a weighted raster algorithm, which provides weights to the different types of data sets that we use. We have a population module where we are looking at densities, displacement, income, and the age of a population. A pathogen module requires the growth curves for the pathogen. We have a climate module that looks at the temperature and precipitation variability in a particular region. We have a water and sanitation module, which looks at the availability of safe drinking water and the sanitation infrastructure at a particular location. And most importantly, we have an interaction module, because if there is no interaction of the population with the water systems, the likelihood of a diarrheal diseases will always remain low. The pathogens will always remain in the environment, in the water systems, but the outbreak is going to be highly unlikely. The interaction module has data sets on natural disasters, anthropogenic disasters, and the civil status, meaning is there going to be a civil war? Is there going to be a migration of a population, and so on. And once it is basically fed into our raster algorithms, it produces a map. The map gives us a value of cholera in terms of high, low, and medium. We can also classify in 5 different risks, but we mostly focus on the high, medium, and the low risk of cholera. How did we basically develop this model? It depends on our hypothesis. The hypothesis was validated using 50 years of data sets from 1875 in India, where cholera outbreaks were reported often with high mortality rates. So these data sets were collected from British Indian libraries in England. And what you're seeing here is that the odds of cholera outbreaks during above and below average temperatures were quite significant, meaning that the above average temperatures, the odds ratios were significantly higher than those with the below average temperatures. And when that is combined with the precipitation, the same story holds true, meaning that the odds ratios or the odds of cholera following the heavy temperatures or anomalous temperatures and the anomalous precipitations were considerably higher than the below average precipitation. So that formed our basic thinking process on establishing the modeling architecture. We validated this algorithm in Haiti in 2010. There is quite a discussion in literature on origins of Haiti. We think, and we have a microbiological evidence as well, that this is a complex outbreak which cannot be pinpointed on a particular source on what caused the outbreak in Haiti. But if one has to go with the hypothesis that we have developed, what we see here is that the temperatures were quite quite high when the outbreak was reported. So the outbreak was reported somewhere in May and June timeframe. So we have a very warm temperatures, which is followed by very heavy precipitation, and that led to a start or an initiation of an outbreak in Haiti. And then came a hurricane. This was, I think, Hurricane Thomas, and that led to like a massive spread of this pathogen in human population, leading to a full-blown outbreak. We also argue here that the rainfall is not linearly correlated or not linearly associated with cholera outbreaks. Historically, what has been done is that if there is a rain, it was basically, well, this is the rainy season, we are going to have cholera in a particular location. We argue that that's probably not true. More rain does not mean that there is going to be a cholera. Moving on to the validation phase, we validated this thing using individualized outbreaks in several parts of Africa. So in this one, what you're seeing is a countrywide outbreak at a particular location. And the black arrows are the months when the outbreak was reported. So the previous 8 weeks when the temperatures were high, followed by previous 4 weeks when the precipitation was anomalous, we saw cholera cases that resulted in an outbreak. Again, like there needs to be an element of social disturbance, and it was present there. It was either the civil unrest or it was a natural hazard. Once we were confident on our algorithm, like where these outbreaks were happening, we applied it in a near real time for Yemen. We were able to predict the Yemen cholera with about 92% spatial accuracy, meaning that the 92% of all the regions where the cholera cases were reported were captured by our model. So these are the Yemen cholera cases in 2017, 18, and 19. And then when we validated our model using a standard correlation coefficients, the Kenneth-House and the Pearson coefficients, what we are seeing is that except for one location, the correlation coefficients were statistically significant for over 3 years, which gave us one of the first indications of real-time applicability of the model that we have developed. In terms of sensitivity, specificity, precision, and accuracy, for Yemen, we were around 60 to 70%. It's not too great, but it's better than flipping a coin. So we know that why our accuracy and precision is low, because we didn't have the water and sanitation infrastructure with us, and we didn't have the pattern recognition algorithms at that time with us. But again, like we were somewhere between 60 to 70% in terms of these parameters. When we looked at the time series with the computed risk, we have a pretty good match. Again, like it's not going to be R square of like 0.9. That's just not going to be possible, but we do have a pretty good match with the risk scores that we are generating and the cholera cases that were reported in Yemen. We applied this modeling strategy after Typhoon Amphan in India, where there was a significant concern that there is going to be a major cholera outbreak. Our model suggested otherwise, which was in a direct conflict with what WHO's stand was. We maintained our stand that the risk of cholera is going to be low. If the risk of cholera is low for 4 weeks, there is no cholera outbreak in a particular region. We did this for Typhoon Amphan. We also did the same thing for floods in Pakistan last year, where there was a considerable concern that there was going to be a massive cholera outbreak. We suggested that the risk was medium, which means that the risk was not sufficiently high for an outbreak of cholera in a particular region, and that was the case. We also validated in a near real time in order to identify which locations are going to be more susceptible to these pathogens, meaning that which locations a particular population should avoid should there be a risk of high cholera produced by our model. This is a little video here, which will show you the power of our algorithms. This is Sudan, where there was an outbreak of cholera, and we were able to basically show a high risk of cholera at least 4 weeks in advance. So we were able to identify those locations like where the water sources should be avoided, and then where population should be careful in an interaction of the water system. So the concern here was this river, which was flooded because Ethiopia received pretty heavy rainfall and they opened the floodgates here. And we suspected that this pond was probably getting contaminated with pathogens. We don't have microbiological evidence, but based on what we have seen, we suspect that this was the primary source which was contaminating the water system. We also tested our modeling strategies with the human intervention in place. 2015 was the time when there was a massive earthquake in Nepal. Our model basically predicted that there is going to be a risk of cholera. We communicated this to UNICEF, and there was a massive movement, relief movement by Nepalese government, and then they provided adequate sanitation, quick sanitation and drinking water systems that basically resulted in very limited cases of cholera in Nepal. We did a microbiological sampling of Vibrios in the water systems, and we were able to suggest that the microbiome of the water systems were pretty resilient when there was resilient water and sanitation infrastructure in place. Once we have a model, once we have an output, we produce three level threats. One is the high, medium, low. We argue that we have to go from the reactionary decision-making to an anticipatory decision-making. The reactionary decision-making means we let things happen and then basically mobilize all resources. We think that this is not going to be a right approach for disease outbreaks and the next pandemics. We need to shift to the anticipatory decision-making approach where the resources must be allocated based on the collective intelligence of models as well as during the field. So we have three threats. One is high, medium, and low. If our model produces high risk, that means that the risk is going to be pretty elevated, and we must basically mobilize resources to limit human interaction with the water system, the native water system. And we also provide understanding on like what to do when we have the medium, high, and low risks of cholera. So how successful are we? At the end of the day, it boils down to the fact that, okay, this is a mathematical model. It has computation engine behind it and all those kinds of stuff. So how successful are we? The accurate measures of success during disease outbreaks is very hard to establish, but we were able to basically control the cholera in Yemen through the predictions that were made using our modeling architecture. Now, this is only a beginning. Cholera is resurging in the entire world. So this is a cholera cases since 2017 in Africa. Africa is becoming a new homeland for these waterborne diseases. It has a massive population expansion, massive scales of deforestation going on, as well as the infrastructure is building. So this is where what we are really, really concerned about, that there might be next cholera pandemics that may origin from here. Cholera is now, since it's a bacteria, it's quite interesting now. It can be cured with antibiotics. The situation that we are facing right now is not that we don't have antibiotics, but are those antibiotics effective? We have seen in our microbiological sampling now that there are increasing issues of antimicrobial resistance genes, which are spread through floods in different parts of Africa. If that happens, that will have quite a serious impact on public health in Africa. And in order to summarize this thing now, this is a summary of these satellites that we have used in our studies so far. We started with CYFS and Landsat, and we are currently at Landsat 9. The PACE and the Sentinel are going to be launched this year and the next year, which will provide us with a very high resolution spectral and spatial resolutions, which will improve the accuracy, or at least like the spatial reach of our modeling system. The entire data sets that I have shown you are available on our website. This website is located on UF servers. This is called the Global Vibrios Prediction Hub, where you can see the risk of cholera that we are producing every Monday for the entire Africa. So we have a county-based maps, so you can zoom it and see like where those maps are. We have a pixel map, which will take a little while to upload. It's a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer pixel. And then we have an experimental product, which we are validating right now, where we are basically taking the continent approach, meaning that we'll be able to provide risk estimates for the entire continent. So right now, for example, in Nigeria, we do have counties which have a medium risk. So it gives you the risk values and it'll give you like the level of risk in that particular region. This dashboard also provides different countries, like where the time series of risk is available. And it is publicly available right now to download and play with and basically contact us if there are issues. The risk maps, the county and the pixel we are very confident in them. The continent-wise is still experimental. With this, we move to the US. So after Hurricane Ian, something happened in US. We saw massive cases of Vibrios, particularly the flesh-eating Vibrio vulnificus in Fort Myers regions in Florida. We have been working on Vibrios for several years now. We have pretty good handle on how these Vibrio vulnificus, the flesh-eating bacteria, basically how it survives in the water systems. When we look more closely, this was the time when the lab moved from West Virginia to Florida, and then we started to look into this idea that what's the spatial trends of these cases in Florida. What we found is pretty alarming. What we have seen is that all the counties in Florida have a pretty positive, statistically significant trends in vibriosis cases since 2001. We did not include 2022 dataset in it because that will provide a bias to the trends because the number of cases were too high. Vibrio vulnificus cases also tend to be increasing in the coastal regions of Florida. Vibrio vulnificus is a reportable infection, meaning that if someone gets it, then it has to be reported to Florida Department of Health. The cases are often underreported. It can be treated with antibiotics. So if a person is not severely sick, then the cases will not be there. But these figures provided a grim picture on how these infections are basically happening in Florida, and then how we have the data sets, but we are not basically understanding the gravity of the situation. And this is particularly concerning because if you look at the sea surface temperatures on the west coast and the east coast of Florida, both show statistically significant rising trends. This basically means that the ecology and the ecological niches of these vibrios will change, meaning places where we have not seen Vibrio vulnificus, the likelihood of this pathogen adapting to that new region is going to be high. We are still working on it. We don't know a lot on the ecological niches of these vibrios in and around the coast of US. So like I said, our lab is a hydrology lab. For us, simulation of floods and then flood heights and all those things is quite normal daily work. This was a 100-year flood simulation, which we prepared for Florida after Hurricane Irma. So more blue color means that that's going to be the inundation depth. So we know like how do we produce these maps and so on. When Hurricane Ian hit Florida, we pretty much know that what the flood heights and how the landscape will look like. For us, flood is no longer a hydrological phenomenon. It is actually a sociological disaster, which basically has a human health connotations associated with it. And when we link the idea of flood with the sociology of local population, we see a pretty grim picture on how things will change in future. So based on this model, what we did, we started collecting samples of water from 3 major shellfish industries in Florida. So it includes whitewood seafood, cutthroat clams, and clam key seafood. Our preliminary analysis, again, it's hypothesis that we are making right now. Our analysis suggests that if we have mean -1 standard deviation of sea surface temperature, and we have mean -1 standard deviation of chlorophyll, the odds of Vibrio vulnificus cases are about 6 times higher than otherwise. How good this hypothesis is, we don't know that yet. We are still working on some pattern recognition and this machine learning type of algorithms to classify these regions, but that's what our current understanding is. And then there was COVID. So when COVID hit in 2019, 2020 in US, we were perhaps one of the first ones to basically ask this question, where this virus exists. Because if we have to build a hypothesis, then we will have to know where this virus is. We were probably one of the first ones after University of Nebraska, which quantified through experiments that there is a potential for this virus to aerosolize and then spread through the air mechanism to human populations. Once we had this experiment, then we started to build the hypotheses on like what is going to be the airborne potential of this respiratory virus for human population. At that point, almost all studies suggested a positive association between cold ambient temperature and the prevalence of COVID-19 cases. We argued that's probably not true because we were seeing COVID cases in the warmer regions. So that created a paradoxical situation. So we wanted to use the similar methodology that we have used for cholera and then see if we can develop a hypothesis for SARS-CoV-2 as well. And indeed, we built that hypothesis. Our hypothesis suggested that there was a constant struggle between the ambient temperatures, which separated the spatial zones of infection in human populations. We found out that if the temperatures, ambient air temperatures were less than 17 degrees, then we have the low temperature hypothesis playing a role in causing the disease. When we have the ambient temperatures greater than 24 degrees, we also saw the outbreak of cases in human population. We identified that there is perhaps a comfort zone of 17 to 24 degrees centigrade, where we were seeing pretty low cases of COVID-19 in human population. Our hypothesis for the low temperature was that the dry air, the air that has less moisture, ambient moisture in it, it basically aids in aerosolization of this virus in the built as well as in the natural environment. And then the human population here is exposed both to the indoor environment, the built environment, as well as the outdoor environment. And that basically impacted how lungs function. And then the traditional transmission dynamics start. And then basically, once the disease initiates, then it becomes a transmission game to basically understand how disease is going to spread. When in the high temperature zones, which means regions like Florida, Arizona, Texas, and so on, we saw that the severity of COVID was less than the colder regions. But still, the aerosolization of this virus was happening in the built environment. And how it was happening, based on the experiments that we did, we found out that the HVAC systems that we had, it basically removed almost all the moisture from the air. It made the air too dry. That basically made the virus be suspended in the air systems more than it has to be there. So that basically resulted in the exposure of this virus to human populations. And then once the infection starts, then there is the transmission dynamics that kicks in. And then basically the cases start to rise. When the region transitioned from cold to warm and warm to cold, during this 17 to 24 degrees, we saw a decrease in the COVID cases. Again, using this hypothesis, we improvised our cholera model, and we basically used the density functions, economic stability, age, diversity, housing, vaccinations, masks, social distancing, immunity, all these kinds of parameters to basically develop a COVID airborne infection index. Again, it's not the traditional epidemiological time series based model. It's the scores that is being produced, which is quite different from like the traditional epi models that basically produce the infection risks. So we were somewhere between 60 to 80% accuracy. I'm going to show you the statistics in a minute on identifying regions like where the COVID risks were high. We tested this algorithm in the hot climate conditions and the cold climate conditions. The hypothesis basically made perfect sense at that point. We also did a detailed analysis, the odds ratio analysis for hotter regions and colder regions. And then basically this idea of cold and warm temperatures hold true in all these regions. We also looked at the efficacy of lockdowns in the hotter climates and the colder climates. We think that the lockdowns in the colder conditions were probably okay, but the timing of lockdowns in the warmer climate conditions were way off when that happened. Again, like there was a lot of discrepancy in how the data sets were collected, but that's what we think from the data sets that is available with us. It's based on a pixel and then converted into the county scales. And we were hovering between like 86 to 96% accuracy for predicting more than 100 cases, 500 cases, and 1,000 cases. So this is the pixel-based risk scores, which is based on this idea that we will be able to capture 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer spatial resolution in that particular pixel. Back in 2021, we also published this paper and we suggested that it's going to have a seasonality. Seasonality is going to be a spatial geographical function of temperature. It's going to basically keep occurring in different modes. And we saw that thing happening in last 2 years. So where do we go from here? What does the climate system shows? Like, what's in it for us? When do we have to basically make a decision or a raise alarm? If you look at the difference between the air and the dew point temperatures, basically the moisture availability. In China, in Wuhan region, this is the time when SARS-CoV-2 happened. The same thing happened when the COVID cases were reported in China. Are these two conditions sufficient, or is there a sufficient memory in the system to raise alarm here or to start monitoring situations when a similar spike in the environmental, climate, and weather system happens? That's the question that we are trying to understand at the moment. We're trying to see like how climate and weather systems come together and change human behavior in a way that it basically enhances an interaction of a pathogen in human populations. We also think that the pure decisions based on numbers is probably not going to be a good approach because the numbers are not going to be available to us. The time series, epidemiological time series are not going to be available to us at that moment. So we are trying to develop some heuristic frameworks at the moment on understanding how these things work and interact. And we have a pretty big group at UF and different regions where we are linking the geophysical processes with the ecological processes to understand when and where these predictive intelligence systems can be built. I'm going to end here with a quote from Eliot's The Hollow Man. He beautifully summarizes that between the idea and the reality, and between the motion and the act falls the shadow. And that's the shadow that provides us with an opportunity of interdisciplinary knowledge making for basically understanding when and where these pathogens will interact with human populations. Thank you so much.
I'll just start off with a reminder that the theme of this meeting is research integration. And believe it or not, these two topics both fit well within that theme. They're sort of the very extreme ends of what I think of as research integration. One is, how do we learn from science, as Andrew Warren says, eat our own dog food? How are we going to arrange to integrate our research better? And the other extreme is, given that we have these powerful computational models, how do we integrate them into the global epidemiological context, which was one of the main goals of this center. So with that, thank you, Antar, for staying online, and I'll open the floor to questions to either of these topics.
I have a question for Noshir. It's a very quick question. Thank you, Noshir, for that very interesting presentation. I'm wondering, the work you described on the relative increased effectiveness of people who reached outside the networks, where can we read about that? Is that published?
Yes, it is published in Journal of Applied Psychology. Let me pull up that. I'll send you the site in the chat, and then maybe that's one way to do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's intuitively, thank you for expressing interest in it. The article is fairly academic, as you can imagine, these things, but yes, the findings were very clear in this respect.
I think Jeff has a question.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Noshir. That was a really interesting talk. I wonder if you could just reflect on, so when I think about it, I have like a basic idea. I would just like you to reflect on and add, since you've thought about this much more, what elements in addition play onto that. Like, one of the main findings you had was the reaching out more to the outside groups. One of the things about the pandemic was it suddenly became as easy to reach out to outside groups as it was to reach out to people internal to your group, because it was all the same kind of mode that you would do it. So how much does that play into that change? Obviously, the productive folks ended up taking advantage of that. So is it just an openness to reaching out and then that component, or is there an additional component, basically, I'm trying to understand like how would we break down what was the motivation of the individuals to do that compared to what their availability to do that kind of question would be.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Jeff. And it is exactly why this research went in thinking that is the ability to do electronic communication with anyone, is it liberating or not? And your point is exactly right. And that is, there's nothing that stopped us in some ways from reaching out to anyone, anywhere, because the hurdles were reduced for everything. There was a leveling effect, right? You're not next door to someone's office. You can reach anyone. I think that what this shows us is twofold. One is that you are more likely, and this is an established fact in a lot of the previous literature on virtual teams before the pandemic. Let me give you the context for that. So you have virtual teams before the pandemic, right? So people worked on globally distributed teams in software and so on and so forth. And the one key finding everyone told us at the time was, if you want your virtual team to be successful, see if you can get them to meet once face-to-face before they get started. Because once you're met face-to-face, now you can go virtual and you'll be able to do things. What this is basically saying is that we are much more likely, we feel much more comfortable to talk to people online, those with whom we have had some previous in-person activity. And that's the stickiness of the in-person relationship. Now, one can make the case that today we may be changing in general to realizing that we need to get more comfortable with just meeting somebody for the first time online. We were forced to do that during the pandemic. Many of us, I don't know about you, but I can tell you many people who I met for the first time online, when I finally, several months later, in some cases a year later, when I met them in person, I was like, oh my God, I had no idea you were this tall or this short, because we sit and look at each other's face on our screens. We don't know other parts of our body, leave alone anything else. I think we've become better now at being able to click online. But I think what we saw in the pandemic was perhaps a general tendency that we have known before the pandemic, and that is online interactions are much more comfortable and become much easier to us if we had previously had in-person interaction with them.
Great, thanks.
Then if I could ask a question of Antar. At one point, you showed a timeline and you were talking about developing models starting in the 2020s. And I suspect that means that you had to put together teams, virtual teams. Is that the case? How did you do it? How did you bring in people working on coupled natural and human systems with civil unrest and all these different factors that are in your models?
The work actually started in 2015-16. We went to WHO and then showcased our work, and then a few interested folks got in touch with us, and that's how we built that team. So there was a data set that we needed at that point. It was the displacement data sets, which UN OCHA provided that to us through their own mechanisms. But 2020s was the first time when we implemented the product. We started building back in like 15, 16.
So you knew each other in person before?
Yeah, we did. For us, we still old school, so we still believe like that meeting in person is a little bit better. And the regions that we work in, they have very different social context of interaction. You have to sit down with them, explain, and all this kind of stuff. Zoom rarely works there, or like online system rarely works there. So that's what our experience has been. So we went and we met them.
So maybe I'll ask one for Antar and one for Nosh. I have many more, but I won't hog the stage. So maybe my question for Antar is a very nice paper that's shared with Stephen and Kathy. And this is our colleague Carlson, who's started a center in George Washington or Georgetown. But there's a paper that they've talked about understanding the increased risks due to increased human animal interaction. Actually, climate change, effectively speaking, temperature increases and chances of us interaction. One of the thoughts that I have based on your work is we could potentially build a global map with the kinds of populations that we have developed here and the satellite data that you have, and construct this risk map, because I think that would be very useful as we do the climate change based policy analysis. So that's for you. But question for Nosh is, Nosh, I think it's a really nice talk, and one question that you have already alluded to in the end is the notion of privacy. Do we want to do this or not? If you could shed some light, because we know that people are very uncomfortable sharing this for many reasons. But maybe one related question that could also be useful for COVID is, how have these interactions helped with the mental health issues? Because I think that has been a very big question, especially for children, and of course adults too. But more and more evidence that COVID had this. The long COVID part was the mental health issues of children. Can you shed some light on maybe such tools could be used to understand it? I don't know how one would do it. So I'll let you folks, maybe Antar, you can go first, and then Nash.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point. When it comes to see how the changing climate is going to be impacting where and when pathogens are going to be. We do have some studies with us looking at Vibrio cholerae, but again, we have never went global. So that's certainly something that we should think about. We don't have the computation power. Actually, we never needed that you guys have. So that would be something to talk about. So the reason that we collected these all Vibrio's data sets was that we wanted to understand whether their movement is random or it is dictated by some weather climate processes or some anthropogenic processes. But we haven't gone very far with that one. So certainly that could be an exciting topic.
Thanks. Yeah. We'll come back to it, I guess. If Nosh is done. Yeah, go ahead, Nosh.
So I think that to me, it's really interesting to see how you've been able to take these two talks and find commonalities and find different ways in which they complemented one another. And I definitely appreciate that, because I must confess that when I was first invited, I'm like, really, how do I fit into this? But thank you for helping me appreciate how you saw that these talks all fit together. So I appreciate that. The privacy issue is a huge issue. And in the HBR article that I mentioned, we had a box item talking about that. One thing I will say about that is, in general, one way to get people to feel more comfortable about this is to see if they get some value add for it directly. The worst scenario is to tell an employee, the bosses are looking at my network, they're making decisions about it without my knowledge, and I'm just like chopped liver. But one of the things we've done in all the work, including the studies that I reported here, is we provided each employee with a private confidential report about their own network and about their ability to engage in ideation, influence, and so on and so forth. And what that did is twofold. One is it says, oh, I can now see that I myself am empowered and getting insights about my network, which I didn't have. By the way, Microsoft has an entity called Viva Insights, VIVA Insights, where Microsoft itself is trying to take your Office 365 data and provide you insights about it. They haven't gotten to provide network insights per se, but I know this because they've spoken to me about it because they want to do that. So if you are able to provide and empower the employee with information about their own network, that makes them more open to this. The second part of it is they are also able to tell you if we got it wrong, because sometimes these data are noisy. People have multiple accounts, the same account is used by multiple people. And just like the credit rating system, where we have the ability to look at our credit score, and if we think someone has stolen our identity, we can appeal it. The same way, by showing them the network, not only do they get insights, but they can actually flag to us if we made a mistake in mapping their networks. And so I would say that is there. On the burnout issue, we have some studies right now that we're doing. We did a national sample in China and the United States. I should have mentioned that both of these projects are funded by the NSF. And so we have collected a lot of data on burnout and in organizations And so we are looking at those data to see, I think it's called the Maslach burnout inventory, MBI, which is a pretty classic measure of burnout. And we are trying to see what predicts burnout. I have a student currently who's working in my lab on that for her dissertation research, but I don't have any results. But I agree with you, burnout is important. One finding there was a big study done by Microsoft. Jamie Tevan led a team at Microsoft looking at Microsoft's own internal digital trace data. And they found that software developers were actually more productive during the pandemic than before the pandemic. However, that's the good news. The bad news was that at the end of it, they also were more likely to suffer from burnout as compared to before the pandemic. So that is one study I would recommend. It's a great, one of the most authoritative studies that I've seen that Microsoft released about the effect of the pandemic on work contexts. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. To say that all the organizers, Stephen, Gold, and other folks, these two talks have really come together well. It's not shared. So I would, I would give kudos to you folks. I think they cover a wide spectrum. The global part of the epidemiology is covered, and the long COVID part, where we are starting to pivot away from COVID to long-term implications of it. And this is an epidemiological question that Nosh has raised, plus the computational system. So I don't know how many others have a question here, Nosh. So the other thing I want to say is Simon had made this very important observation during our last round when we got our reviews, which is that, collaborations happen to some extent organically. You can't force collaborations in place. And he also made an important point that it's not just our internal network that matters, but really how we are reaching out to others. I think, Simon probably has the best Simon index, in my opinion, in the world, among people here. But I think you folks joining us today is extremely valuable for us, because we think this is our first step to start growing our network into two somewhat different directions, but both of them are really important directions. And so I want to thank you both for joining. And I think, Simon, you're right. I think this will allow us to grow our network outside, which has got as much value as looking internally to people on this network.
I believe Anil had one question, and then maybe we can close.
Is there time? Or,
yeah, how about Anil, you have the last question. We'll
the really great talks, and I agree with Madhav, beautiful pairing of it. Maybe one more detailed question for Antar. So I presume the water infrastructure would play a role in how people interact, right? So do you have data on that in these regions, or do you take that into account?
You're absolutely right. Water infrastructure is critical, both water storage, dissemination, consumptive use, and all those kinds of infrastructure. We have some data which is collected by UNICEF's joint monitoring program. It's not the best data. And if there is a way to use some algorithm to classify that data sets, or can provide those data sets to us, we are more than happy to basically talk to them and then see if that can be done. If there are other algorithms that can basically suggest that how that infrastructure is going to be available. It's one of the major restrictions to that success of our algorithms to go from 70% accuracy to higher. We have inbuilt algorithms for water bodies, which is pretty run-the-mill type of stuff for us, but not for the water infrastructure. We lack that thing. So if there is anything on the floor, if you guys have, or if your team has any insights, please do reach out to us. It's not only the cholera that is important to us. It's the waterborne disease part that is important to us.
We'll close the first session with that, but thank you to Antar and Nosh, both of our excellent speakers this morning.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, and we'll see
Thank
everybody
you again,
back.
Antar and Nosh. What a brilliant talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.